There's just something about Mary. This past week, I got my sermon prep done on Tuesday. I did that because I knew it was going to be a busy week, and I wanted it done early. So by the end of Tuesday, I had about 5,000 words of notes on our large and significant readings for today. And then on Thursday, I had morning prayer online with the leadership of the diocese. And afterward, a colleague mentioned a sermon that I needed to check out. The sermon's entitled, All the Marys, and was delivered by one of the greatest figures in modern preaching and theological thought, who also happens to be an Episcopalian. Diana Butler Bass. So on Friday, I sat down and read that sermon. And that dramatically changed what I ended up preaching today. So as I said earlier, there's just something about Mary. No, I'm not going to preach on the hilarious and wildly inappropriate film from 1998. But it has a great title. So in All the Marys, Diana Butler Bass didn't actually preach officially on our lengthy gospel reading today. Instead, she preached on Luke 10, chapters 38 to 42. And now, being good Lutherans and Episcopalians, I'm sure that all of you could very quickly tell me what Luke 10, 38 to 42 is all about. Right? Right? Shocking. Well, in case you're not that much of a biblical scholar, this Luke passage is about Jesus visiting with Martha, and a Mary. It's the passage where Jesus responds to Martha, being frustrated with her sister with the Martha, Martha, with the implied head shake. And that is a powerful and rich passage with many layers. And yet, in her sermon, Diana Butler Bass really didn't touch on that passage. Instead, she actually focused on today's reading from John's Gospel. So what did Bass talk about in her sermon? What would motivate me to cast off 5,000 words of notes? Well, it's just something about Mary. Now, Bass told the story of a friend who was working on a master's degree in theology, like a real weirdo, and focused her studies for her thesis on today's passage from John. And as part of her research, she looked at online scans of the oldest and most complete version of John's Gospel, one that dates to around 200 years after the birth of Christ. So just a few generations after Jesus was crucified and rose again. Now, of course, this version of the gospel didn't come in the Queen's English. And the words of Jesus were not written in red. No, this was good old biblical Greek. And Bass's friend had learned Greek for this work. But very quickly she realized something interesting. Perhaps something wrong. Now the reading I thankfully just finished began 45 verses ago with a certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now what this graduate student noticed when looking at scans of the oldest and most complete version of John's Gospel seemed to be a typo, or the equivalent of a typo. What she read in the original, translated from the original Greek, would translate as, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary, and his sister Mary." The village of Mary and his sister Mary. No, Lazarus did not have two sisters named Mary. This was not the precursor to George Foreman and his 5 sons, all named George. What this graduate student instead deduced is that early copies of this gospel, that were made of this gospel, made by hand, of course, had made some changes. First, it's worth remembering that the gospel according to John has some very interesting sentence structure and phrasing, to say the least. And that's not just the case in the English versions. The over 1,800-year-old version of John's Gospel in biblical Greek also had very unique structure. And that's the best explanation for what seems to be like the repetitive use of Mary here. But wait, you might think, isn't that second Mary actually a Martha? That's the key. In this oldest and most complete version of John's Gospel, the Greek word that we translate as Mary is there twice in this verse. But all subsequent versions of John's Gospel translated that second Mary as Martha. This is likely the result of somebody misreading and thinking one Greek letter is actually a different Greek letter. And thus the second name, the second reference to Mary became Martha. And around the same time, someone was trying to clean up the unique phrasing of John's Gospel. And so they simplified the verse. The village of Mary and his sister Mary became the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And that also helps explain the repetition in this passage. And what I just read, both Mary and Martha said the same thing to Jesus. Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. That line is there twice. because it gives something to say for both of the sisters of Lazarus. And splitting Mary into two people also lessens the impact of a very important verse in this reading. An essential line in the whole gospel. A fundamental line in all of the gospels. In verse 27, we heard Martha, or Mary, respond to Jesus, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." That was a pivotal moment in the Gospel of John. It is the only time a figure of any significance acknowledges Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. In this gospel, there are many times when Jesus uses the phrase, "I am," when referring to himself. And this refers back to the holy name of God, which itself dates back to Moses and the burning bush. So multiple times in this gospel, Jesus declares that he is the Messiah. But only once does someone else proclaim Jesus as Messiah. And in the other gospels, there's only one other major figure who makes such a Christological proclamation. Peter, who said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So that puts Martha, or more accurately, Mary, in the same company as the one whom Christ called the rock on which the church would be built. But in her sermon, All the Marys, Diana Butler Bass wasn't finished. She went further, suggesting that this singular Mary that we know of is also the Mary that we know of as Mary Magdalene. And that puts this passage in a new light. Because, not to jump 2 weeks ahead, but on Easter Sunday, we will hear from John's 20th chapter. And no, I don't expect you to immediately know what that is, but Easter morning, Mary Magdalene in the garden, and Jesus chose to appear first to Mary Magdalene. It's the passage where she confuses him for a gardener, but then immediately she knows who he is when he calls her by name. Mary. So today's reading is telling us of Jesus going to the village of Bethany and his interactions with Mary. Perhaps Mary Magdalene. And this Mary, who declared to Jesus, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And possibly, this is also the Mary to whom Jesus chose to first appear after the resurrection. And that means there really is something about Mary. So what does all of this mean for us today? We are being invited to be unbound and set free, just as Christ commanded of Mary's brother. We are to be faithful as Mary was, not skeptical and cynical as the crowds were. We are to be like Mary and proclaim our faith boldly. And we are to open up our minds to God working in mysterious and incomprehensible ways, just as Mary was. And so, as we face the swift and varied changes of our world, especially in the times of war and suffering, let us remain focused on the promise of resurrection in all of its forms. And let us never forget that there is just something about Mary. Amen.